This is the Master Brewers Podcast, brought to you by the Master Brewers Association of the Americas, a volunteer organization dedicated to continually improving the products and processes of our membership since 1887.
Let's go!
Master Brewers brings you interviews with the industry's best and brightest in brewing science, technology, and operations.
Calm down, I'm moving too fast.
Support for this podcast and the following message come from the Master Brewers Bookstore, where you can find must-have titles like the Practical Handbook for the Specialty Brewer, Beer Packaging, Conference Proceedings, and more. Visit mbaa.com/store to build your brewing library and make better beer.
It might sound hard for people to think about this now, but in 1800, Germany didn't have a very good reputation for beer. And then the next weird bit is the fact that someone set up a new private brewery in communist East Germany in 1949 just to brew Gose. I keep saying to people, you know, the whole thing about IPA, everyone thinks IPA is this huge thing that's never ever going to disappear. It's always going to be there. And all I would say is history proves you wrong.
This week on the show, Ron Pattinson gives us a look back in time at the sour beers of 19th century Germany.
If you go back before 1850, German brewing looks very different to what it is today. What people think of nowadays as German beer is mostly really Bavarian beer and has very little to do with the stuff that they brewed in the north of Germany. Well, not very little. It has absolutely nothing to do with everything they brewed in North Germany until about 1860, when you first have lager beers turn up. And so you look at the traditional North German styles, mostly they're very low alcohol, quite often sour, quite often made either with wheat in them or even multiple grains. Basically a brewing tradition that has much more in common with Belgium than it does with Bavaria. And you see that's how the sour beers fit in there. And something like Berliner Weisse, I would say, is in a continuum of sour beer styles, sour wheat beers that goes from Poland all the way to the North Sea coast. And so Berliner Weisse is in the same family, I would say, as Belgian Witbier and Belgian Gose. That these are all beers of a similar family. You've got different sort of specific ones that pop up all over the place, but this is a generic thing. And you have to think of pre-1850, North Germany basically fitting in with Belgian beer styles more than it does with modern lager styles.
Were there any other sort of main beer styles of the day that were, not intentionally sour?
Well, not all the North German beer styles were sour. A lot of them were. And the level of sourness probably varied depending on how they'd been made. But it was all very small-scale stuff. I mean, you also have these insanely strong and hoppy beers as well that they brewed in North Germany. I mean, even though the vast majority were under 3% ABV, you get the occasional crazy 11% one, like Adam beer, which is a completely different type of beer, which is also sour, but sour in a different way. And they were competing with beers from abroad. So it might sound hard for people to think about this now, but in 1800, Germany didn't have a very good reputation for beer. And you read German sources and they say, well, the better beer comes from either side of us, so either from Bohemia or from England. And that Germany's actually not that good at making beer. And it's only really when you have Sedlmayr modernized lager brewing in the 1840s after he'd been to the UK and he'd learned about modern malting techniques, he'd learned how to use a hydrometer, all stuff like that, then you suddenly see that Bavarian brewing modernizes and industrializes, and that basically takes over the whole of the rest of Germany.
Yeah, let's talk about that more because there was a big shift in the second half of the century. You just mentioned some of the things, but what really happened there?
What really happened? You find that once Settlemyre has put lager brewing on an industrial basis, then you see the whole of the industry in Munich first, and then in a lot of the rest of Bavaria modernizes. You have the same thing happen in Austria, and it's this new powerhouse of brewing, and it basically just bulldozes the north of Germany. And so in the paper, I find that the one table is really interesting, which is showing beer output in the last couple of decades of the 19th century in the Brausteuergebiet, which is basically North Germany. It's basically the non-lager bits of Germany. And you see that the amount of top fermenting beer being brewed stays virtually constant, whereas the amount of bottom fermenting beer virtually triples. And so what you see happening is that there's this old industry that's basically just going nowhere, and this new industry that's come in and completely takes over.
And that's over a pretty short period of time, right? Like maybe 20 years or something?
Yeah, over 20 years. But this is when the Bavarian breweries got the chance to do this. And it's not just the Bavarian breweries. It's the Bavarian breweries bringing in their beer to North Germany. And then the second phase is you get all these new breweries being set up. So if you look at the North German lager breweries today, you'll find that very few of them have founding dates before 1850. The reason is that the old top fermenting breweries didn't convert to bottom fermenting, which is what happened in some countries. You had a completely new set of breweries move in. So what you had is these people, all these, it's all to do with the whole Grunder type thing in the second half of the 19th century. You really have a huge industrial expansion in Germany. And lager brewing in the north is part of this. And so it's people that come in. You've got these old, small, family-owned, family-run top fermenting breweries, and then people come in, they found limited companies, it's all very modern, they raise all this capital, they have these big fancy new lager brewing plants, and the older breweries just can't compete with them long term.
Let's hear about Berliner Weisse, both past and present. There was a lot that you wrote about that really surprised me there.
What, about it being smoked at one point?
Yeah, that's for sure.
Yeah, that's one of the things that I found most surprising when I looked into the history of Berliner Weisse. I spent a lot of time looking at it, and weirdly, it's probably the best documented of any German beer style. And I think that's partly because you've got the VLB. And so people from there paid lots of attention to it, obviously because it was a local style. And so you've got the professors from there wrote about the style in immense detail. So I've got really good stuff about it. But yeah, the thing about it being smoked, that really surprised me.
I also was really blown away that I didn't realize it was sold, a day or two after being brewed. That really surprised me.
Yeah, this is really typical of I think this is one of the reasons a lot of the old top fermenting beers were low alcohol, that they were sold incredibly fresh. So they didn't even really complete the primary fermentation in the brewery. This is the thing, the further you go back into history, this is more typical, actually, that the beer leaves the brewery earlier. It's like with porter. The big innovation of porter was, in fact, that they didn't have the beer leave the brewery right at the end of primary fermentation, that they aged it themselves in the brewery. And that was something no one had done before in Britain. So this is 1720 in Britain, that is when they basically started aging the beer properly before they sent it out. And it's really typical of all these North German styles. You see it with Gose, you see it with brown beer, that they all do the same thing, that they send the beer out really, really young. Primary fermentation finishes in the sort of reseller or the pub cellar. And then
they actually bottle it themselves there too, right? And
they bottle it. And another common theme is they water it down. So, I mean, some of the things in the article where I've got these analyses, obviously these are the beers as they were sold. So the beer, when it got to the publican or the reseller, might have been quite different. It might have actually been a fair bit more alcoholic, but that's just how it ended up, because this is obviously someone's gone around and has bought beer that's on sale. And so then you get what's on sale, not what's left the brewery. And this seems to be a recurring theme. I keep reading about this, about these North German styles, about them watering it down when they bottled it.
Wow. How about, do you want to talk a little bit about kind of managing the mixed yeast and bacteria cultures and sort of how that evolved?
Yeah, well, it seems to be slightly shrouded in mystery, but it's in the second half of the 19th century where, obviously, I can see what's happening. You've got the whole of societies industrializing, and people are going to look at the processes more closely. And I assume that originally, Berliner Weisse, it just relied on picking up lactic acid bacteria during the process, and that would do the lactic part of the fermentation. And then at a certain point, obviously, people wanted to control it more, and they managed to come up with these mixed cultures. I've never understood how they managed to do this, because they always say it's difficult to get them to work together. But if you see one of the people from the VLB, Schoenfeld, he did this wonderful thing on where he was analyzing all the way through the fermentation process. He was looking at the balance between the Saccharomyces and the lactobacillus. And it goes all over the place during the fermentation process. And then at the end of it, magically, it's the same proportion again of the two. So they'd obviously found something magical here. Because, I mean, I know, for example, Adnams in Britain, they have 2 yeast strains in their pitching strain, right? And they have to have both of them, otherwise they can't get the flavor and the attenuation right. But they don't propagate at the same rate, so they have a huge problem trying to keep the 2 of them in the right balance in their pitching strain. And when I heard that story, I was thinking, God, it's amazing what they've done in Berlin, that they've managed to have these 2 things that are completely different and yet somehow automatically balance each other out during the fermentation process.
Tell us about kettle souring and the technique behind that.
No, this drives me nuts, actually. Right. You have the Franke method, where the one guy did it for a bit. It's not in the 19th century, it's in the 20th century. It's just after World War I think. And he played around with doing this method. Didn't do it for that long because he couldn't get the beer to taste right. And the main reason he couldn't get the beer to taste right was because it didn't have the Brettanomyces phase in it. But in general, the Franke method was very, very briefly used in Germany. A lot of people seem to think that this is a traditional method in Berlin. This kettle souring, really not. I mean, you look and see what was happening in the 70s and 80s with the remaining breweries, and there were 2 methods that they used. You had the one that all the other breweries used, and you had the rubbish one that Kindle used. And what the other ones did, so the one in East Germany and the 2 or 3 other ones left in West Berlin, they all did a mixed fermentation. Saccharomyces, lactobacillus together, fermenting at the same time. What Kindle did, they did separate fermentation. So they split the wort, half of it was Saccharomyces, half of it fermented at 45 degrees centigrade with lactobacillus, then blended back together again at the end.
Okay.
I was really glad when I found out this is what they did, because I never liked their beer, the Kindle one. And I was happy to find out that they hadn't brewed it the right way, and that's why it didn't taste right. And so there were several problems with this method, but the big one being that it didn't have the Brettanomyces phase, so that if you don't have the Brettanomyces at the end, you don't get the right character of the beer, you don't get the low enough final gravity, you just don't get something that tastes like Berliner Weisse, as far as I'm concerned. And I was so happy to find out that there was a reason why the Kindle one didn't taste right.
I was there actually studying at the VLB about the time that they went to premix, and so before most of the syrups were being added at the pub, but they started adding some of those
No, that's
at the brewery.
it's just so wrong. Being honest, though, I mean, in my time in East Berlin and then in the 1980s, in the communist days, they quite often had draft Berliner Weisse in Berlin. And they always looked at me really weird when I drank it straight.
Huh.
Because no one did. Everyone drank it mixed by that time.
Yeah.
But I mean, I'd already got used to Belgian beer by then, so I quite like sour beer, so
there you go.
Berliner Weisse. Well, it was wonderful. I mean, I'm so glad that I got to taste the East Berlin Schultheiss Berliner Weisse, because that was such a magnificent beer.
What year would that have been?
This was 87, 88. It's honestly one of the best beers I've ever had. It was as good as the very best lambics.
Coming up.
I used to wish that more people brewed Gose, and I've come to regret that after having seen all the abominations that people make.
I'm John Bryce, and you're listening to the Master Brewers Podcast from the Master Brewers Association of the Americas. Here's what's coming up on the Master Brewers calendar. Don't miss the Draft Line Cleaning Best Practices webinar January 16th. District St. Louis meets January 18th at Anheuser-Busch InBev. District New England meets in New Hampshire January 19th and 20th. The 2018 District Ontario Technical Conference is January 24th through the 26th in Niagara Falls. The District St. Paul Minneapolis Scholarship Fundraiser is January 24th at Indeed Brewing. District Northern California holds its technical conference February 2nd at Sierra Nevada and Chico. The District St. Paul Minneapolis February meeting and scholarship drive is February 8th at Surly Brewing. District St. Louis meets at O'Fallon Brewery on February 18th. The Fundamentals of Cut and Stack Labeling webinar is February 19th. District Mid-South meets at Mill Creek in Nashville March 2nd and 3rd. Districts Michigan and St. Louis both meet March 15th. And check out the speaker lineup for the 2018 Eastern Technical Conference March 23rd and 24th in Atlantic City. View the full calendar of events at mbaa.com for more details or to find a district meeting near you. Now back to the show. Let's get on to Gose. That beer style has been has a pretty colorful history. How about guiding us through that?
All right, Gose. Started off in Goslar in the Harz, then, which is where the name comes from, the Goslar River. Then moved over to Leipzig for some reason and became heavily associated with Leipzig in the late 19th century. Was never a style that was brewed in any great quantities. If you compare it to say, Berliner Weisse, there was a time in the late 19th century where they were brewing a lot of Berliner Weisse, and it really was one of the major beers drunk in the city. Leipzig, it was never like that. There were only ever a limited number of Gose pubs that sold, that concentrated on Gose, but they were a minority of the pubs and nothing like most of the beer sold there. I did work out how much I'm just flicking through the article here to find out, because I know that somewhere I've got I say exactly how much Gose was brewed, but it wasn't very much. I mean, I think it was like about, here it is, 7,500, 10,000 hectolitres a year, so what's that in terms of US barrels? 10, 15,000?
Yeah, and the history is really interesting because it kind of, disappeared for years at a time, it seems like.
Yeah, I mean, the problem was that it basically only had the Ritterguts brewery that was brewing it in the 20th century. There were more breweries if you go back into the 19th century, but after World War I, they pretty much had a monopoly on it. And when they were taken over and closed by the communists after World War II, that was basically it. And I find it amazing that it made a comeback after that. The fact that there's just been this one brewery that made it, there was never a huge amount of it. And then the next weird bit is the fact that someone set up a new private brewery in communist East Germany in 1949 just to brew Gose.
He must have really liked it.
yeah, I know. It's just like, what?
Yeah.
What?
Yeah. So there's a few other interesting things about it. So obviously it had salt and ground coriander, and like Berliner Weisse, like we were talking about before, Gose was also delivered to the taverns while it was still actively fermenting. The thing that really surprised me, you wrote about the characteristic long neck bottles that weren't actually closed with a cap or a cork, but with a plug of yeast that naturally went up the neck. That sounds crazy. Tell us about that.
Yeah, well, it is crazy. So basically the way that they seal the bottles is they just have the long neck. It's very active. I guess there's a lot of yeast in it, and it just naturally forms a yeast plug in the neck as it ferments, which is, I'm not sure the last time anyone did that. I think the last time anyone did that was in the 60s. I mean, you still have the Bayerischer Bahnhof. They use the bottle, so it's like a brandy bottle, but with a giraffe version of a brandy bottle, basically. No, it's a weird thing, but I also found it really interesting. The thing about the whole thing about it reminds me of the whole cask beer thing, in that there's a lot that the landlord in the pub inputs into the beer in its final state. And so the whole thing about how customers would like it at different ages, so the landlords would have bottles of different ages so they could give it to the customers depending on how sour they wanted it and stuff. It's quite and you can see that the brewery didn't have complete control over how the finished beer was.
Very little control, it sounds like.
Yeah.
It would drive me crazy.
Well, it depends what sort of brewer you are and how much responsibility you take. To be honest, in Britain, it's a recurring theme in breweries that they go crazy, British breweries, about all through the 20th century, about the publicans not handling their beer properly. And just despairing that they've produced this really nice beer, and then there's all these idiot landlords who ruin it before it gets sold.
Yeah,
but I had this great experience. I was at the Harvey's Brewery Tap in Lewes, and Miles Jenner was going and getting us beers, and I noticed that he's the head brewer there, and I noticed every time he was going up and he was first getting a half and tasting it before he ordered all the rest. And I was saying, "Oh, what are you doing there?" And he's saying, "Oh, I'm just making sure the beer's presented in the condition that I would like it to be." So basically, he was checking that the beer was right before he gave it to us. I used to wish that more people brewed Gose, and I've come to regret that after having seen all the abominations that people make.
Well, what advice do you have to those who are making it to make it more authentic?
Less salt.
What else?
Less salt, no fruit. And don't go crazy with the coriander. That'd be my advice.
All right.
And make sure it's properly sour, because it should be. I recently found the original spec sheet from the first trial brew of Gose, and it gives the pH. And so this is the one where he took it, where Goldhand took it to the people who were hardcore old Gose drinkers. And so this is like about 20 years after they'd had the last one. So you have to, be a bit reasonable. But this has got a pH of 3.1. So that's like enamel stripping sour. And you have to think, right, people aren't going to say something like that. That's not like a flavor you're going to forget. You're not going to say, "Oh, that's right," if it hadn't been a really sour originally, would you?
Well, Ron, it occurred to me while reading your article just how low cost many of these beers would have been to produce. I mean, the bulk of the energy costs are eliminated with air drying malt and minimal or no wort boiling. The beer is still fermenting on the way to the pub, so you're not tying up a bunch of vessels. I'm curious to what extent you think sour beer production could have been driven primarily by economics?
Well, everything's driven by economics. I'm a materialist. I believe that economics drives everything. So yeah, of course it did. And if you can produce beer that people like, and are prepared to pay money for, and you can do it really cheaply, you will. And that's why these beers died out. It's because people came up with something which was, I was going to say better, not necessarily better, but something that was consistent and also quite possibly cheaper. When you have the big industrial breweries turn up. So, yeah, I mean,
it's just kind of amazing to me to think about it from a managing a brewery standpoint. I mean, energy cost is your biggest cost, and so you've taken out all the energy of
Yeah, well, you've also taken out a lot of the energy of moving the beer from the brewery to the consumer, because it's not going to be going very far. And this is the thing, that these were very fresh beers. You could compare it to the whole New England IPA thing, where you've got beer that's very perishable. And so you've got something where you're basically giving it to people as soon as, or even before it's finished.
Yeah.
And you can do that if you're selling selling beer in the next street and, maybe one town over. You try doing that over a large area, and that's not going to work anymore. And you see that a common factor of all these beers is that they were always only ever available in a really limited geographical region.
Yeah, that's right.
So they were sold pretty much where they were brewed. They didn't do any traveling or anything, and that's the other thing that the lager breweries have, that they have beer that you can ship over large distances. So you're not confined to this tiny little local market anymore.
The conclusion of your article lacked optimism. You wrote that a revival of sour beer styles is unlikely in Germany, and that it's more of a question of whether what little remains can cling on. Why is that? Why the lack of hope for craft beer like renaissance for these beers?
Well, the weird thing is that in Germany, you've got the craft beer thing going on, but they're just brewing not German styles, they're just brewing American styles. I find that really depressing, because Germany's got this amazing heritage of different types of beer and loads of stuff that you could plug into. And just brewing, a double IPA, West Coast style. Where's that taking you, really? But that's what people want. That's what the younger market in Germany, at least at the moment, wants. They want stuff like the people drink everywhere else, really. Which is depressing. I work with one guy who does. We actually did an East German style porter beer, and he's into doing the old German stuff, but very few people are, and it's depressing because Germany's got such an amazing history of beer brewing, a really, really varied one. So you can find anything you want in the German, in the German history. So why do you have to bother, just pretending you're in California?
Right. Grass is always greener, I guess. I don't know.
I find it weird. I really do find it weird. And, I try and I do my best to try and get people to appreciate their own beer cultures. And it's. I'm not saying that it's bad what's going on in the US, but if everyone just copies what's going on in the US, then the world's a poorer place, I think.
Yeah, agreed. Ron, you wrote about the dynamic nature of beer styles, with many or perhaps most beer styles exhibiting dramatic changes throughout their history. I'm very curious what you think about beer competitions like GABF, where so much energy goes into hitting a style guideline that is perhaps just a snapshot of a single point in a given beer style's complicated history.
Well, I think it's. I find it slightly crazy. Having said that, I judged a competition not that long ago in October, which I think was to the BJCP rules. So, I think that the idea of trying to pin down bid styles is ultimately futile. They're always moving around. They don't stay still. But this is what makes them fun. Right. If beer history was all about people brewed Pilsner in 1842 and then everyone brewed stuff exactly like that right up until now, well, where would be the fun in that? But it's actually much more complicated, and things are always moving around. It's what makes things fun. I keep saying to people, the whole thing about IPA, everyone thinks IPA is this huge thing that's never, ever going to disappear. It's always going to be there. And all I would say is history proves you wrong.
That was Ron Pattinson here on the Master Brewers podcast. If you like what you heard today, check out his article in the Master Brewers Technical Quarterly, volume 54, number 3. You can get there from the publications menu or by typing Pattinson into the industry's best search bar at MBAA.com. 130 years ago, Master Brewers was built on the concept of brewers helping each other out so we could all make the best possible beer. That's still true to this day, and it's where a lot of the camaraderie in this industry originated. Master Brewers' award-winning Ask the Brewmasters is the best place to go for troubleshooting, where you'll find the industry's only discussion forum that's moderated for technical accuracy by a team of experts. See what everyone else is talking about at community.mbaa.com. United, we brew.
Maybe two things that you should have known.
Did you enjoy today's episode? Would you like us to keep making more? If so, there's a really simple way you can let us know. Subscribe, rate, and review the Master Brewers podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts.
Well, I can't get stuck, I can't be losing too much, and then I'm heading out to any other place.